Good morning, everyone. On behalf of agcareers.com, I would like to thank you for joining us for our web seminar, Acing Today's Interview. My name is Bonnie Johnson, and I'm a marketing associate with agcareers.com. I will be serving as moderator for today's webinar. Our presenter will discuss different types of interviews, key preparation, making a good first impression, and appropriate interview follow-up. We'd like to thank Ag1Source for sponsoring today's webinar. Ag1Source is a valued partner of agcareers.com and one of the most trusted and reliable recruiting firms in the agricultural industry. We are pleased to have Mike Kennecke as our presenter today. I will more formally introduce him and turn things over momentarily, but I would like to briefly review a few housekeeping items. Your lines are muted to help with the timing and the flow of the presentation. At the end of the presentation, we will take time to answer questions, and we'll do that using the chat or question area to avoid cluttered conversation. If you do have an immediate question you would like addressed during the presentation, we ask that you use the chat box that is part of your GoToMeeting panel. I will monitor the questions closely, and if not answered immediately, they should be addressed shortly within the presentation. During the presentation, the slides will move automatically as the presenter shares the content. Please move your mouse around every once in a while to keep your computer from going into sleep mode. If for some reason you have to shut down or have problems, you may rejoin the workshop. You just need to follow the same process to get started as before. Finally, after the workshop, I will be sending an electronic evaluation form via email. We'd appreciate your feedback on this quick survey. Okay, that should be everything. Please allow me to introduce our presenter. Mike Kennecke leads and directs the Ag1Source Destination Employer Program. This is a proven process that enables employers to create a high-performance environment where employees are excited and engaged about their workplace, retention is high, and company brand is well recognized. Prior to joining Ag1Source, Mike held the role of HR Recruitment and Talent Management for Ag Partners LLC, a Midwest-recognized agronomy and grain organization. His responsibilities included overseeing recruitment, staff management, training, and organizational development for 240 full-time employees. Mike is a graduate from Buena Vista University with a bachelor's degree in Human Resource Management and is a designated professional of human resources with 9 years of service in human resource roles, 7 of those in agricultural-focused HR and recruiting pursuits. And with that introduction, I will now turn it over to Mike.
Well, thank you, Bonnie, for that introduction, and thanks everyone for joining this webinar regarding acing today's interview. So I promise you we're going to have an engaging dialogue. There's a lot of neat tactics and tricks that we can utilize to get that competitive edge, not only to ace the interview, but to create a great first impression. So I'm happy to share some insights that I've observed and utilized in my career and seen as we work with clients throughout the U.S. and global areas. So let's go ahead and get started here. As I mentioned, Mike Kennecke with Ag1Source. And let's talk about the scope of our discussion. So what I'd like to address today are kind of the basics. How has interviewing evolved from in the past to the future? What are the types of advancements that interviewers are taking place today in terms of the delivery of the interview? How do we go about as an interviewee to prepare for these interviews? Of course, we want to talk about first impression management and how to create that positive experience. And then finally, how do we conclude or end the experience? I'd like to first talk a little bit about foundational work. Let's talk about interviewing and how it has evolved. And think about this in terms of you as a manager that might be on this webinar, evaluating how you modify or improve the interview experience for yourself, for your company. Think about also yourself as an interviewee and some of the accommodations that you might need to make to ensure that you're capable of performing a great interview in different environments. So let's talk about technology improvements. you as a candidate in past time had other candidates involved in the interview process that likely would be in your local area, maybe in a regional environment. Today, likely not the case. Managers, companies are posting their jobs from a global perspective. Technology allows us to do that. So you as a candidate are armed to need to be competitive, not only in your local environment, but in a global perspective. As we look at the World Wide Web, it has allowed us to connect with candidates virtually anywhere across the world. The use of phone is certainly a consistent method of doing that that's proven itself, but the emerging trend includes the utilization of web interviewing. And we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about that here briefly. We talk about the evaluation measurement criteria in terms of social media. You as an interviewee have the opportunity to create great brand recognition for yourself. And in today's marketplace, it's not just the mere fact they may ask their neighbor down the road about that candidate, about their quality, about the individual and the potential fit, what they might bring to the table in terms of the position that you're interviewing for. But they're looking at things like social media. If you have a Facebook page, a LinkedIn page, it might even include just a quick Google search on you as a candidate that are going to be interviewing for this position. So be cognitive of those things as a candidate interviewing, because you want to create a great first impression. And if you haven't even set foot in the organization or had the ability to interview, and you have a bias already against you because of what's on your social media page, you've got more work to be done there so you can land the interview. The other thing that's emerging and becoming fairly consistent is the use of assessments. Assessments in terms of skills, in terms of aptitude, leadership, personality style, what have you. They're becoming more consistent in hiring practices in terms of how interviews are being conducted. So as candidates, we need to ensure that we're comfortable performing those assessments. And furthermore, when we articulate the responses to questions that are asked during the interview that might be related back to these assessments you took, we can clearly articulate our abilities. Companies today that are progressive really take a strong interest on cost impact in terms of the quality of the hire and what it means to the organization. They look at things like ROI in terms of how quick can this individual get up to speed, provide me return on my investment, not only fit the culture, but prove to me that they're going to be a long-standing asset with the organization. So some of the criteria that I came up with that I think are relevant, that I think in today's day and age as we interview for a position, there's a lot of other criteria that determine whether or not we're the right individual for the job. So let's go over a little bit about styles of interviews. I've kind of put these in two different buckets, but let's talk about the most common ones. So the face-to-face interview, absolutely most common. You'll continue to see this. It's going to continue to resonate because we want to gather information about the candidate. We've already pre-screened them perhaps over the phone, and we understand they meet the basic duties and functions of the position, but now we want to bring them into the organization. So face-to-face is one style of interview. First impression management's huge in this capacity. We'll talk more about that here later on in the webinar. Group or panel interviews is another very common style of interview. One takeaway that I would reflect on either face-to-face or group is be cognitive of making sure you have all your information ready to provide to these individuals. Okay? One of the things that I used to see really commonly was when we'd bring in individuals into our organization and we'd perform group interviews, I would find that they weren't prepared in terms of having the appropriate amount of resumes to provide to our panelists. That was one thing that really deterred our interest in selecting candidates. It impeded our ability to have an effective interview with that candidate because we'd have to share resumes and our panelists weren't able to review that information as accurately. So be cognitive of that. That might be one tip just to express as you go into a group or face-to-face interview. And again, I'm going to go over this at a very high level. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about first impression management and some of the tactics that we need to utilize as we go into these face-to-face dialogues. Very common is the phone interview, allows us to go through, and most commonly used in the pre-screening method. But one thing that I would say in that regard is the phone interview allows us a great opportunity to express ourselves. Think about it in terms of when I articulate and communicate a response to a question asked over the phone, how do I articulate the information that on their end they can frame up a mindset or a picture of who I really am? Could they think in terms of themselves as saying, hey, can I see that this person is smiling, that they're energetic, that they're a positive individual? We don't get that opportunity in a face-to-face interview to express and get a true picture of who the individual is. So we have to work extra hard to articulate and use different styles of verbal communication to express our excitement, to express other areas that we'd like to share about our abilities and interests. More importantly, I think what needs to be known is there's emerging use of different styles of web-type interviews. I'll talk a little bit more in depth, but these two come to mind. These are types that we utilize within our organization. They're a great tool to utilize in terms of capturing those nonverbal cues, to be able to interview somebody, typically in a pre-screening method of interview, from a very remote distance across the globe, across multiple states, what have you. And this has been around for a while, but technology has advanced to such a degree that this style of interviewing will continue to be more consistent. And so as somebody in the webinar today that's maybe been exposed to this or maybe hasn't, I would tell you that it's on the rise. And so for us as candidates, our opportunity to be comfortable in front of a web interview, to be able to articulate and communicate is going to be very critical. And why that is a lot of these companies have the ability to record this information. So your first impression management is absolutely critical. Some of the takeaways that as a candidate you need to be cognizant are your ability to make sure your surroundings are positive in terms of if you're doing a web interview in an office space, you know, what's on the background, what's on the walls behind you, okay? Does it look cluttered? Is it organized? Is it not? Okay, those are some little things that human nature, yes, we're going to listen to your responses, but we're scanning. We're looking behind you and we're seeing, okay, what's the office environment look like? What's the environment look like in the room that they're performing this web interview? Does it seem like they, you know, they're making all these judgments on who you are as an individual beyond just what you're saying. So we need to be cognizant of that. And because they're recorded, let's say you didn't get the job, but the information is recorded with that company, they can utilize that information years down the road, maybe reevaluate you, but that impression you made a few years prior is still there. And so we need to be extra cautious about that. But there's an interesting study in the November edition, 2014, of the SHRM magazine, Society of Human Resource Management Group. And the article talked about the rise in video interviewing for recruitment. And they worked with a group, the Aberdeen group, which performs talent analytics. And in 2013, nearly 32% of their sample group of employers were utilizing web interviewing to perform interviews in some capacity. Now, you look a year prior to that in 2012, and half of those individuals were only using web conferencing or web interviewing to perform interviews. So it is on the rise. It will continue to get on the rise. It's a great tool to utilize to maximize cost efficiencies for companies, to be a little bit more advanced than just the phone interview, so that they can visually see you. You can visually see the manager interviewing you. You can utilize all the senses in terms of communication. Another emerging trend, and I had the opportunity to work with a group that we utilize this information, is a validated phone interview. Okay, the validated phone interview allows hiring managers to go through a series of questions based on a job family. Let's say it's sales, let's say it's manager, maybe it's customer service rep perhaps. But these companies have validated the behaviors that individuals that excel in these different job families, by example, how they perform, and they can ask a series of questions over the phone to help give predictability in what that individual will likely do or how they perform if they're brought in to the organization. So there are companies out there that do these validity studies and even elevate the phone interview to that. So you as a candidate, knowing this information, be wary of how you react to questions. I mean, you need to be authentic. You need to respond to the questions accordingly. But there are companies out there that utilize this, and it does help improve the efficiency and predictability of the candidate. The last thing I'd like to share is assessments. I talked a little bit about that in the previous slide, but assessments are a growing trend as well, whether it's skills-based, behavioral-based, cognitive ability, leadership, aptitude, EQ. They're all validated assessments that help give predictability in what you'll do as a candidate if you're brought into the organization. And so what I would share for those that are interviewees is that when taking these assessments and granted the opportunity to come into the organization interview, it gives you the opportunity to then clarify, yes, the behaviors that I truly have naturally as an individual. I shared and expressed those in my assessment I took. My leadership capabilities are true to the assessment that I took as well. And so it gives you the opportunity to reinforce that, yes, the data points in the assessment are accurate and they are true, and yes, I'm expressing those in the interview as well. So maybe another little tactic, competitive advantage that you can utilize as a candidate interviewing for a position. It's been said that companies that utilize 3 or more validated assessments for either hiring or talent management practices can improve predictability of a candidate or an employee that's advancing throughout the organization up to 90% or greater as far as predictability in what they're being assessed for. So think about that. You as a interviewee interviewing for a position, maybe we've got managers on the call on the webinar here that are looking at maybe some different tactics or principles to utilize to measure talent. These are great tools to utilize. So how do we go about and train for the opportunity? I want to share a really fascinating study. I actually saw this on the TV on the Discovery Channel. There's a show out there called The Brain Games, and it's based off a Harvard research study. But what it essentially did is there was a group of students that tested whether changing one's nonverbal behavior prior to a high-stakes social evaluation could improve the evaluated task or the outcome of that high-stakes situation. So in terms of negotiations, interviewing, what have you. And they actually had a sample group that did mock interviews. And they had a portion of those individuals perform these power poses, so to speak. So you see the gentleman on the right, he's got kind of his hands on his hips. He's got kind of an open pose. His face is tilted up a little bit. What they did was they coached these people to take deep breaths, to think positively, to do these power poses. And what it told them, or what it concluded, was that when they went into these interviews, they had 5 minutes to prepare, and then they went in and they had to share their strengths, qualities, and why they should be hired for the job. They actually did this, and they studied it, and they found that the individuals that performed these power poses actually had more confidence, they boosted their self-esteem, and they were more prepared as they went into the interview. Now, from a biological standpoint, what that does is it actually changes your body's chemistry, believe it or not. It actually raises your testosterone level by 20%, reduces cortisol, and it actually makes you feel more confident, believe it or not. So might be a little trick you can use. I'm not condoning it. I'm not saying that we promote that with our candidates. It's just a really fascinating study. And so if you find yourself in a position where you have nervous jitters, that you have anxiety coming into an interview, this might just be one thing that you can use to get that confidence that you need to go into the interview and be able to promote yourself the way you'd really like. So there's our guy, Mr. Clark Kent, in the Superman power pose. So how do we get perspective on ourselves? This is all preparation on going into the interview. If you're early in your career, you've been coached by your advisors at the collegiate level, do the mock interviews. Even senior level individuals that are going into a tenured job that they want to apply for and get interviewed for, this holds true as well. Do the mock interviews, okay? I like to use the phrase, perfect practice makes practice perfect. Perfect practice makes practice perfect. When you choose somebody to interview you, don't find somebody that's going to be weak and be just lax on asking just vague questions to you. Pick somebody that you trust, that's going to be critical, that's going to give you great feedback, that can tell you about some of the nonverbal cues that you give off so that you can diminish those as you go in and perform in the interview. Okay? It's all about body language. You have to be cognitive of what your trigger points are. If you're asked these critical questions and you fear that that question might be arised, make sure it's stated in the mock interview. Get comfortable with that tough situation and be cognitive of what your body does in reacting to that so that you don't do it in the live interview. Okay? Seek advice. Get advice from peers, people that you trust, so that you go into the interview with no doubt that, hey, this is typically how I act. I need to modify that a little bit. I'm not saying you want to be false. You need to be true to yourself. But as far as polishing your skill set from a body language perspective, there's some things that we could do there. The last piece, and I think this is great too, and I highlighted it because you as an interviewee, if you understand the principles and some of the pitfalls that some hiring managers make, you have a competitive advantage. And so I'd like to share those with you. The first is called the halo effect. And you may have heard of this, some of the tenured folks on the call or webinar, but essentially what it is that interviewer is only perceiving the good qualities in the candidate and they're overlooking the poor. That's advantageous for you as an interviewee. That's great. But as somebody on the webinar here that's a tenured manager that's hired a lot of people, might be an opportunity to modify that a bit. A good company and a good interviewing party, a good interviewer will look equally at the good things and the bad or the poor things within a candidate. So that is one type that is a pitfall for interviewers. The other is the horn effect. And this comes down to first impression management, but it creates a bias about the overall qualifications of you as a candidate for the job. So we're going to talk about first impression management. We're going to talk about leading with positive comments and things of that nature, but if you've struck a chord with that interviewing party or if that interviewer that seems negative in nature, if they're the type that may be a little bit skeptical in nature, they may just continue to look for all the negative things in you as a candidate versus the positive things. And that's called the horn effect. So we need to be aware of that approach as well. The other thing that I like to share too is that great companies allow a lot of time for the candidates to respond to the questions and articulate their capabilities. And you may find that if an interviewer or panel of interviewers are interviewing you and you don't get the opportunity to express all your capabilities, motivations, interests, desires, you're really limited in your ability to sell yourself. And so knowing that, you've got the opportunity to know, hey, it would appear that they're doing a lot of talking. I need to, when asked to respond to a question, really try to maximize that time. No doubt that one of the most common questions that we all face when we go into the fundamental line of questioning is, what's the strength that you have, what's the weakness? And so how do you overcome that? And how do you somewhat spin this so that you are consistently leading with positive information? There was a really neat video that I watched where they took two identical twins and they had them go into an interview, and they had randomly selected interviewers to interview these two twins. They dressed identical in nature. The same series of questions were asked to these two. But the key difference was this. They had one twin go in and respond to questions with positive responses, and then, if there was a negative spin to that, then that would be second. Furthermore, the other twin went into the interview, and her responses to the interview questions started off in a negative capacity, and then, concluded that response with a positive spin. And so what the study concluded is that the managers interviewing these two gals had more inclination to hire the twin that responded positively first in those line of questioning. So another thought about how you can utilize that when it comes down to some of these fundamental line of questions. I like to use the example. This might resonate with you. If asked that question about what's your biggest strength, or you talk about what's your biggest weakness, you might say something like this. I'm one who's proactive and forward-thinking. I like to think big picture in terms of accomplishing goals. I found that I often get ahead of myself to overcome this. I utilize a task manager application, and I break down my tasks to complete any large goal into manageable bite-sized pieces. Furthermore, I partner with my teammates who excel in small tasks to ensure that we don't miss any steps to accomplish our large goal. Wow. There was a great example of how we took a positive statement. Even though we're sharing our weakness, we started out with positive information. It shows you have initiative. It shows you're proactive. You recognize what your weakness is, but in the past, here's what you've done to right-size it and how it continues to make you a top performer. Okay? You're not being untruthful, I don't think. You're just framing up the response to your question a little bit differently. So think about that in terms of how you would respond to just some of the fundamental line of questioning. So what does that actually mean? It actually comes down to this. The brain favors more information it receives first. Okay? The brain favors information it receives first. As you're responding to questions, think about that. The brain favors information it receives first. Start out with positive information before going into any negative information if the question is to really try to draw out some poor qualities, I guess, of yourself. So think about that. I've got a link that you can do. This actually is the link to watch the video of the two twins. It's a quick video, maybe 8 minutes at best, but really interesting, really fascinating. Might give you some competitive advantage going into the interview. As I mentioned, first impression management is absolutely critical. It's so critical that one author, Mark Boughton, says it's the first 10 seconds of meeting anyone that they determine whether you're friend or foe. This goes back to just our primitive biological makeup. When you meet somebody, you either think to yourself, wow, I like that person, or I don't. You're making judgment calls on that individual. Okay? You're picking up on nonverbal clues. appearance, posture, gesture, touch, facial expression, eye contact, tone of voice. That makes up 93% of communication. 7% is only words. So for us to have great first impression management, we need to be able to maximize that 93% because it is extremely critical. It's extremely critical. Okay? So ask yourself as you go into the interview. We talk in terms of etiquette. We've got a model here on the right, kind of showcasing some different things that are pretty elementary in terms of what we need to prepare for, but maybe ask yourself this before you go into the interview. What would your mother say in terms of your attire or your demeanor as you went into the interview? Okay, if you're accustomed to coming into the interview and maybe it's a truck driving position and you always wear hats, this is what you do, ask yourself that question. If you're going to go into that interview, that's something your mother would say is appropriate to represent you, to represent her, your family. I mean, it's very basic, but you look at the etiquette in terms of first impression management, it's simple things like that. How do we polish ourselves as we go into the interview? Okay? There was a study done by MIT that using a sociometer to measure the unconscious verbal signals between people. And what it concluded was that body language can predict the outcome of interactions such as job interviews, dating negotiations, and other things with an average accuracy of 80%. So another reinforcement to say that our nonverbal cues are extremely important in landing the job interview, in actually performing the job interview to a degree that gives us a wow factor, that gives us a competitive edge. I came up with this phrase myself. I believe in it wholeheartedly. It says, how can you articulate what you have done in the past that will give you insights to what you can deliver today and in the future? I was taught the phrase that the best predictor of future success is past success. I absolutely believe that. I absolutely believe that. So in terms of yourself and articulating your capabilities, your motivations, your interests, your cultural fit, things of that nature, how can you articulate what you've done in the past, how it meets or exceeds the needs for the position, and how that's going to be a predictor for what you can do and deliver for the future, for that job, for that company? Absolutely imperative. Great companies who interview candidates have different principles as far as style of questions they ask. I was taught that interviews should consist of at least 60% of behavioral-based questions, okay? Behavioral-based questions, nearly 60% or greater. So you, as a hiring manager, have the ability to elevate maybe your interview style to do that. Those that are interviewing for the position, think about that. If 60% of the questions or greater are going to be behavioral-based, I need to think in terms of responding to those style of questions beyond just my skill sets, my capabilities, my education. We understand that. We see that in your resume already. It's the other pieces of the pie that we really want to identify, okay? And make sure that your examples that you provide follow these guidelines, that they're recent, relevant, and repeated, okay? Going back to the phrase, the best predictor of future success is past success. Share those examples, that they're relevant, they're recent, they're repeated, that you've got a predictable behavior that's proven to be successful, that gives them no doubt as you go into that interview. Okay, we need to articulate beyond just our resume. How we're the perfect match? Because if at least 60% of these questions are behavioral based, it's way beyond just the resume and what they see on that piece of paper. Okay, perfect match in terms of culture, in terms of occupational interest, how you think, how you behave. We need to think about that. What are our strengths? What do you bring to the table that's unique and advantageous compared to the other candidates? Don't short sell yourself in regards to your strengths as they relate to the position. In some cases, it may even be relevant to provide work examples. And I know that's not extremely common, but if there's a stack of 50 or 100 resumes for one job and you land the interview, let's say it's a marketing position and they don't require, but you're providing some of your marketing pieces as an example of your work. What a great opportunity to gain a competitive advantage, to show your interviewing party that, hey, here's some of the work that I've done, and here's how it relates to the job and some of the capabilities that I have available to do. It might be, in past times, we would hire a lot of truck drivers, so it never failed. It was just really interesting. They always come to the interview with copies of their MVR and the driving record report and their endorsements and their certificates and things of that nature, because that's what they were used to doing, because that was, it told us as interviewers, hey, this is the criteria they come with, and so we had no doubt. So in some cases, it works really well to do that. What are your motivations? This is a great opportunity for you to articulate your passion and motivation for the position, that you're truly interested, that you truly have the desire to, if given the opportunity, to take these initiatives on. You've already thought forward thinking about what you would do if given the opportunity. You'll find that that sometimes is a very common question. They'll ask, hey, if given the opportunity to come to this job, what would you do in the first 90 days? Great opportunity for you as an interviewee to already have some game plan in mind if given the opportunity. Okay? Reinforce your behaviors and your traits that are conducive to the position, that actually make you the perfect match. Okay? They might be doing assessments to help get predictability and validate that, but let's leave no doubt on the table, and let's make sure we express that in the interview. How do you lead? How do you act? Progressive companies are looking for leaders. They want to understand your leadership style, how you interact with people. The outcomes of your leadership style, is it conducive, supportive with the culture or not, and what are the outcomes associated with that? And overall, we are judging on a cultural fit. So you as a candidate coming into position, do you match or do not match the cultural fit? Hopefully you've done your homework and have identified the culture of the company and can articulate some of your true values that complement the current culture. I've used this in the past. I think it's totally relevant for this situation too, but it says that people can be like icebergs, and I truly believe this as well. But in terms of your company that you're seeking employment for, in terms of the hiring manager or managing party, they're going to get your resume. On average, they're going to scan that. They say 10 to 15 seconds is about all that's looked or reviewed on a resume to determine if they have the basic qualifications, education, experience, skill sets, things of that nature. Okay, but it's this other piece that's extremely critical, I believe, and this is another area where you as a hiring authority, if you're a manager on the webinar, have the ability to tap into the remaining 80% of who that person really is. And you as an interviewee need to articulate these different areas by example to ensure you're the right fit for the opportunity. Because if they're progressive companies and they're good interviewers, they're going to ask a lot of behavioral-based questions, and they should, and that's what we are trained to do, because we want to learn about the remaining 80% of you as an interviewee and how you're a fit for the position or not. So think about hypothetical questions that you would respond to in terms of your thinking style, your behavioral traits, your occupational interests, and the overall fit for the position. When you do that, you know that you've provided them 100% of who you really are. You as a hiring manager know that, hey, I've tried to capture nearly 100% of who this person really is. And it gives both parties better predictability on the job fit for the position. Let's talk about culture. Brian Kropp with CEB This is his phrase. First 18 months on the job can be attributed to how the employee fits within others within the organization. I believe that's very true. Culture is extremely crucial to the success or failure of anybody coming into a job. So they may be highly proficient in their knowledge, skills, and abilities and aptitude to do the position, but if they don't fit the culture will dismiss them. Things will happen that eventually they will realize they're not a fit. And so in terms of you as an interviewee, how do you articulate how you are a great fit and leave limited or no doubt that you're a great fit for the position? Let's talk a little bit about ending the experience here. I got about 10 more minutes of dialogue, and then we'll get into some questions. When you get to the end of the interview, they always ask, hey, do you have any questions for us? Golden rule of thumb would say yes. Make sure you have a lot of questions. It shows you're prepared. It shows you've researched. And ask the tough questions as well. I mean, it's a two-way street here. Let's be honest. It's about not only you determining if you're a great fit for the job, but they're going to determine if you're a great fit as well. So how do you deliver on pre-planned questions, maybe questions that you thought of as you've been interviewing as well? It tells the interviewing party that you're listening, that you've done your research, and you can capture more of the information that you need to make a decision if this is the right fit for you, if given the opportunity. Express your thanks in their time to interview you. If it's a face-to-face interview, it's a phone interview, if it's a panel or group interview, make it personal. Tell them thanks. If you got, let's say, 5 people interviewing you in a panel, and you conclude that interview, try to address each individual and tell them thanks with the first name, with the handshake, firm handshake, eye contact, leaning in ever so slightly. That was one tact I learned. I took a Dale Carnegie course years ago, and he talked about professional speaking. He talked about how to be cognitive of your body language, and it was a phenomenal exercise, just the little things like that, like leaning in, making sure that you articulate and call people by their first name. Make it personal, okay? I love this. I'm a true believer in it as well. Be a salesman. Make advancements. What does that mean? Well, it's about asking for the sale. It's about saying, hey, if given the opportunity for the position, what would be the next steps? It's saying things like, would there be any additional things I could provide you to help you in the hiring decision or hiring process for the opportunity? Wow, now there's a great advancement. It's essentially kind of a presumptive close. You're asking for the sale. You're asking them, hey, I'm ready to take the next step. Tell me what I can do to help ensure that we come together on this. So might be a great advantage for you to give you that competitive edge, to leave a lasting impression. Conclude with confident gestures. So beyond the handshakes, beyond the personal thanks, the first name basis, you're getting walked out of the building, which is common practice too in face-to-face or panel or group interviews. The small talk, you're still being evaluated, you're still being assessed. So conclude with confident gestures, okay? Reassure, thank them again, those kind of things. The interview really hasn't ended at that point. Follow up in a personal and authentic manner. And this is pretty basic, but you got to know that managers are extremely busy and they get a lot of emails and they're inundated with emails. And we see this with our clients. I've seen it personally. I see it today even within our own organization. But we scan emails. That's just what we do. We're not going to get away from these darn things. But you have an interest to share a thank you back to that interviewing party or that interviewer. Go beyond just the canned email to send them a day or two later. Make it personal. Get a thank you note. Write out your personal thanks. Send it to them in the mail. Leave a lasting impression. What can you do to keep that resume at the top of the file? And probably the last thing, and probably most importantly, you got to be patient. it is tough. We're motivated. We get coming out of that interview, and we're just way excited. We want to take the job. It seems to be a compelling opportunity. We're looking for constant feedback. But we need to reflect on the manager's side of the coin there. You know, they've got multiple jobs they're likely hiring for. They've got tons of candidates, hopefully, that they're evaluating in a perfect world. And they're trying to screen all this and make a great judgment call or determination on who's the right fit. They might be doing background checks and reference checks and things of that nature too. So we have to allow time for all that to come together. And so, you know, my words of encouragement would say, if you're able to, you do the thank you note, make it personal, you give a week or two just to let that set in. But if you haven't heard back from this company in 2 to 3 weeks, it might warrant another follow-up call. And I'm not condoning that you need to be too patient with this, but you need to give a little bit of balance to this too, because there's a lot of moving parts that these managers are taking on day to day, in addition just to hiring for the position that you've interviewed for. So bringing it all together, what are some of the best practices? I've talked about a lot of different things. Talked about different tactics, different approaches to the interviews, different styles of interviews that occur today, and how us as interviewees that are interviewing for the positions need to be adaptable and create a great first impression. Some of the basics, just do your homework. Make sure you know a lot about the company, that when you're in discussion in the interview, you can talk specifically about some of the new things that are going on with the organization, some of the history perhaps, things of that nature that tell them that, hey, you've done your homework, you are passionate about the opportunity to come to work for the company. Utilize ways that boost your self-esteem. And I'm not condoning that you need to be a power pose guy or gal, but what does it take for you to gain the best self-esteem and confidence booster as you go into the interview? And so if it's things as quirky as that, great. I'm not saying we condone or tell our candidates to do that. I'm sure we don't. It's really a recent finding that I thought was very intriguing that I wanted to share with this group. But at the end of the day, how do you boost your self-esteem so you feel confident going into that interview? Articulate your abilities and capabilities. I mean, that's paramount. When you get in that interview, you're wanting to share the other 80% of who you really are. Your hiring company only sees about that first 20% in terms of what you can put on that resume. It's the other 80% that are extremely critical. So how do you articulate your abilities and capabilities? We talked about ending the interview and creating a lasting impression. That also is true in first impression management. Judgment calls are being made, and you're either a friend or a foe. So are you the type that is somebody that's inclined to get the position because you're the right fit or not? So we need to create lasting impressions so that even if you don't get the interview, you were second best, and if things fail with that candidate that they hired, you're going to be the first one they call to come back. Follow up in a professional manner. Make it professional regardless of the job, if it's non-exempt hourly or if it's senior level. It's all about professionalism. How do you continue to make yourself and brand yourself as a top-tiered candidate? And with that, I'd like to conclude. I'm hopeful there's a series of questions that have come in. I appreciate your guys' time. There's a lot of things that we could have gotten into even furthermore, but hopefully you've gained some insights in regards to the style of interviews that are prevalent today, some of the emerging ones, some of the tactics and approaches that can boost your self-esteem and confidence, different ways to create a great first impression and a lasting impression as you exit the interview, and how do you end up acing the interview. That's the whole objective of today's webinar. And with that, Bonnie, I'll turn it back over to you. If you want to kind of share with the group and myself any questions that have come in, I'd be happy to try to address those.
Thank you, Mike. We have had several questions come in. I will go over with those shortly, but if you do have a question now, we'd like to open it up. You may type your question into the chat or question area, and we will give those to Mike, and he can answer them. Mike, one of the first questions that we had come in, it's regarding actually interview questions, and it says, so there's still the question, tell us about yourself, which is a commonly asked. And This participant says, I assume that chronological order is important. Also, what should be included in that response, or what types of information should you share to that question about, tell me about yourself?
Okay. So I'm gauging that I'm not quite sure, I guess, if this is a manager type that asked that question or if it's a candidate, but I think my response will be applicable for both on the webinar here. But yeah, it's a very basic question, a lot of times addressed early in the interview to open dialogue, just to identify what they're willing to tell us about themselves. My best suggestion is think about that remaining 80%. If we use the people are like icebergs, and yes, they've got information on the 20% of who you are, your knowledge, skills, ability, your education, and some of the criteria that meet the minimum qualifications of the job. We really want to articulate the other 80%. You know, we want to talk about who you are as an individual in terms of your behavior, your thinking style, how you approach challenges, what your leadership style is, and some of the maybe the unique traits about yourself that are a fit for the position in terms of cultural fit. So that would be my best advice on that question.
Okay, thanks, Mike. We have another question. What do you suggest, or what is acceptable for a resume, 1 or 2 pages, and how do you decide what to use? Curious on like a college graduate versus someone with 25 years of experience. Again, what's acceptable and what's not in length of resume?
Right, right. Well, let's talk about the entry-level recent college grad. A lot of times the 1 page is not going to be tough to keep it condensed in that capacity, but the information on that page, I would argue that that individual should try to put leadership type of groups, organizations, leadership roles that they've had, been a part of, that give them more indication of who they are, that other 80%, in terms of their capabilities, leadership style, behaviors, that will resonate in that resume. More beyond just the education and some of the internships they did and things of that nature. I want to know more about the individual. Are they willing to jump into extracurricular activities, if it's athletics or if it's non-athletics, if it's civics groups, what have you? How do you paint a picture to me on your resume? If I'm scanning that within 10 or 15 seconds, that's going to make your resume pop a little bit more. Say, wow, I really like some of these civics groups and leadership activities that they were involved in and leadership positions they've held. I think that's a real good start for somebody in an entry-level role, and I think 1 page certainly is easy for them to manage. Let's talk about the tenured professional that's been in the industry 25 years plus, by example. Very difficult to keep that within 1 page. I think it seems to be more acceptable that, yeah, they can get that on 2 pages and it doesn't detour their ability to land an interview. But I would say that what might be a good tip is, in terms of their past jobs, if they've got 25 years of career experience, maybe just list the last 15 years of relevant work experience that are related, that give obviously timeline that's sequenced, that pertain to this position. But you know, you look back at the jobs that they had 15 to 25 years ago. Are they relevant? Yes. Do we need to list them on the resume? I'm not totally confident that needs to be there. You might change that a bit and express it in terms of maybe you have bullet points that show proficiencies in certain areas that were gleaned from those job experiences that you had 15, 20, 25 years ago, but to actually list those jobs, I'm not confident that that's totally relevant. And why I say that is, if a progressive company does their homework, they'll be able to find out some of that information through their research and background checking. They'll be able to ask the right questions that'll glean some of that dialogue in a verbal communication style when they get into the interview. So good companies will figure out, you know, some of those latter career moves that they made 15, 20, 25 years ago.
Okay, thanks, Mike. We have another question. First, a comment from one of our participants. They say they always follow up with thank you letters that are typed out in a professional voice. They wonder if they're losing strength by not doing a handwritten thank you note.
Sure. Well, you know, in that capacity, the fact that you've typed it out is certainly good in terms of being better than an email. And they're mailing this, I'm assuming, the typed letter to the interviewing party or the gatekeeper, if it's the HR professional, what have you. Hopefully they've handwritten a signature. I think that is critical to ensure that it's authentic, it's personal. I don't see a big deterrent in the fact that you type it out. I am just a big proponent of a handwritten personal note, thank you card perhaps, but a typed, professionally typed letter thanking them with your signature at the bottom is certainly relevant. Okay, making it personal, that's what it's all about.
So in your opinion, probably your first choice would be a handwritten thank you followed by a typewritten thank you, and then third choice would be like an email thank you.
Yeah, and I probably didn't mention this too, but it's inevitable. We're in the age where texting is almost common dialogue as far as different styles of communication. Don't go there. Don't send a text to, let's say the interviewing party gave you their business cards. Say, hey, you know, follow up with me anytime you'd like after the interview if you have any questions. That's common, and so you get the cell phone number of one of the interviewing parties, and you want to text them and tell them thanks. I'm sorry. Please don't do that. I believe, and I think others would agree too, it's just not at the same level of professionalism. Okay, try to make it as personal as possible. A text is so easy to do, and it's almost an annoyance. But yeah, I think regarding the other sequence, I would be in favor of those that sequence.
Okay, so we have a few more questions. For the follow-up question, when you are already employed and interviewing for a new position, how do you suggest answering the question, why are you looking for a new job?
Right. And that's totally relevant. It is absolutely relevant. So why are you looking for a new job? Well, first and foremost, don't be fake. You need to be authentic. But in terms of, let's say it's a cultural fit, you know, share that information at a very high level. I wouldn't say you're going to come into this interview and dump, metaphorically speaking, don't dump on why you don't like the company you work for. You know, respond to that question in a professional manner. And let's say it's maybe you're under challenged. Okay, there's a great way to spin it. Say, hey, you know, the opportunity I came into XYZ organization had expectations of this, and I'm consistently seeking to be challenged in my role, and I'm not seeing my company provide that challenges for me. So I'm the type of individual who likes to be challenged and wants to be challenged. That's a great way of spinning the fact that, hey, I am currently employed, but I'm also an individual that seeks to be challenged, and I'm not being challenged in my role. My company led me to believe that, yes, that was true. That might be an example, just sharing an example, but how you respond to that and how I just shared an example of kind of spinning that, I think is relevant. You're not being fake, being authentic, but you're sharing the character, who you are. And you know, you're taking a little bit of leap of faith because you're hopeful that this organization wants people like you that have that integrity, that want to constantly be challenged, by example, that hopefully your response is supportive of the culture that the company you're interviewing for. So got to do your homework a little bit on that, but hopefully I've helped answer that question.
Okay, and another question, is it acceptable to give one example for two similar questions? So I'm assuming if they've asked you a couple similar interview questions and you have one example, can you kind of use that and form that for both, to answer both questions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if you didn't already state some of those details in the first primary question, and then let's say a second question comes down the line later in the interview, and you say, well, in your mind you're thinking, well, my other example I shared was relevant. I don't think it deters the quality of the interview. I think what's important is that the interviewer then restate and say, hey, you know, I shared in my previous example that this situation occurred and this was the outcome. Furthermore, in relation to the question that you just asked, here's that same example and how, you know, this tactic or behavior or style was used in the outcome as well. I think it's relevant, but I would coach more times than not to say, hey, try to get new information out there. Don't just keep going back to the same example, because companies want to know that you're a little bit cultured or diversified, or that you've been exposed to lots of different elements in your career that make you kind of versatile. So if you can share more examples, the better. But
okay, thank you. Another question, at the end of the interview, would it be appropriate to ask, if the interviewer has not brought it up, how long to expect before hearing from the company?
Yeah, I'd be a little cautious on that, because they don't, you know, they don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. So you have to think about the interviewing party a little bit. They'd like to tell you some of those insights, but I would weigh on the side of maybe not asking that as a presumptive kind of advancement on, you know, what can I expect on follow-up and feedback. I would say stay away from that a little bit. You might just ask what I used in the example earlier. Are there additional items? Are there other things that I can provide to you during your evaluation process to help you in the hiring decision? I think go down that rabbit trail versus just saying, hey, when do you think you're going to come together and make a decision on this? Manager, it's going to be tough. I mean, they have a hypothetical. They'll say, hey, you know, our interest is really to have this position filled before harvest. Okay, that's kind of a loose term. It doesn't really hold the manager accountable to make a decision, but it does give you a little guidance. But I would shy away from that question a little bit.
Okay. Another question from a college student perspective. If a college student new grad has 3 internships, and say 2 of the 3 of the internships were at the same company, should they separate out those internships on the resume, or should they keep them as one experience listing? What do you think?
Sure. So I'm assuming that their internship was 2 consecutive summers, so different time frames. Even if they came back in the same role, list them as 2 different experiences. Yes, they're the same role, by example. How do you uniquely share maybe differences from the year prior to the current year on some job duties, functions, tasks, experiences that they're exposed to? Hopefully, if it's a progressive company and they still hire them back as, let's say, a crop scout intern, they've progressed into a more advanced type of duties, and so we want to express that. If it is an obvious different internship role, that's easy. Still list them separately. They're in 2 different years. They're 2 different jobs, and they're 2 different sets of duties and responsibilities.
Okay, another question. Is it okay to ask how many are being interviewed for the same position?
I would a little subjective, I think, on my response, but I would say be wary of that. If they openly share that, great, but I guess I would be cautious to go down that path. You need to know the comfort level of your people that you're interviewing with. I mean, if you already got a personal relationship with maybe a subset of these folks that you're interviewing with, maybe it's relevant because you already have an established relationship. But if it's somebody that you don't know, just met maybe once or twice over the phone, and now you're meeting them face to face, I'm not confident that you should say that.
Okay. When is the appropriate time to ask about compensation?
During the negotiation, no. Don't. I would say don't use it at the conclusion of your first interview or during the first interview. I would stay away from that. If you're asked for a follow-up interview, come back into the organization face-to-face, I think, yes, it warrants potentially at that level because you're getting more intimate in the details. They've asked you to come back because you're likely a finalist, and they're going to ask you even more in-depth questions, and I think you have the right to ask some of those in-depth questions too as well. The most easiest is that they've made an offer and extended that to you, and certainly at that point then you get into the negotiation component.
Okay. The last question I've seen come in is you mentioned about properly preparing for the interview with mock interviews. Do you have specific resources you recommend that provide guidance for those techniques?
Resources. Well, I would certainly offer myself as somebody that could provide those resources. Beyond that, it's not like I have an arsenal or database that I say, here's a go-to, you should look at that. But I would work with that individual and mutually find the right resources for them. And why I say that's relevant is it's going to be different for different levels of candidates. If it's a 25, 30-year vet, I'm not going to have them work with a local college advisor. I mean, if that's more relevant if you're a recent college grad. So, it depends on the level of the candidate and the tenure, but I would certainly open myself to work with that individual to find him some resources.
Okay, thank you, Mike. We'd like to thank Mike for taking the time to be our presenter today and Ag1Source for sponsoring today's webinar. If you do have additional questions you'd like to ask of Mike or of agcareers.com, feel free to email us, and you can just email us at agcareers@agcareers.com. Please watch your email inbox for our follow-up evaluation. We'd appreciate your feedback on today's webinar. And thank you again for taking the time out of your day to learn a little bit more about acing today's interview. And have a fantastic day, everyone.